too. I suppose. You're right. Okay, so Kant. First we're going to do some Hume. Then I'll talk about Kant's theory. And at the end, I'm going to talk about two interpretations of Kant, see if we can make some sense out of it. Okay, so most of the time we're talking about Kant, I want to tell you about the standard interpretation of Kant. But at the end, I'm going to say, okay, here's this other way to think about what Kant's doing here. That makes a lot more sense. Okay. All right, a little review of Hume. Everything that Kant did, and later on we'll talk about Kant's ethics, which is a lot easier to understand. But everything that Kant did was essentially a reaction to Hume. So you have to remember something about Hume a little bit. So if you remember back to Hume, Hume said there are two kinds of things you can know. He called these objects of knowledge. One is relations of ideas, and the other is matters of fact. Okay, so sound familiar? Relations of ideas, matters of fact. A relation of ideas was knowable by reason. Okay, you can know that relations of ideas are true from reason alone. Now, if it's a matter of fact, you have to know that by experience. Okay, so example of relation of ideas: triangles have three sides. Okay, what makes that true? It's just the meaning of the word triangle. So there's a relation between the concept of triangle and the concept of three-sidedness. Triangularity includes three-sidedness. That's the relationship. So therefore, you can know, since triangle means three-sided closed plane figure, you can know that statement is true. Okay, and you don't have to look at any triangles to know that that's true. It's just what the word means. Okay. On the other hand, something like the triangle is equilateral. The only way you can know that's true is by measuring the sides. Okay, that requires empirical evidence. You have to see to know that that's true. Okay, so then we get this chart. Here are all the different kinds of senses for Hume. Hume says we can have statements that are a priori and analytic. Okay, a priori and analytic. Example there would be bachelors are unmarried. It's just like triangles have three sides. A priori means known without sense experience. Okay. Analytic means true by definition. So every statement that is a priori for Hume will also be analytic. They're only analytic a priori statements. Notice the X there. That means there's nothing in that category. There's nothing that's synthetic, that's not true by definition, but is also knowable by reason. If it's not true by definition, you're going to have to get it from sense experience. So if it's synthetic, it has to be a posteriori. That means knowable by sense experience alone. Okay, so an example that is synthetic a posteriori, the rose is red. Okay, so is that true? Maybe, but you're going to have to look at the rose. Why? Because there are also yellow roses and pink roses and so on. Okay, so just because it's a rose, it doesn't guarantee that it's red. It's not part of the definition of rose that it's red. Okay, that's what it's saying. So since it's not part of the definition, you've got to look at the rose. You have to verify that visually by experience. Again, we can't have anything that's analytic and a posteriori. If it's analytic, it's true by definition. And if it's true by definition, it wouldn't make any sense to say that you had to verify by sense experience, right? You would just have to know what the words mean. So it all makes sense. Okay, those are the only two kinds of truths for Hume. Okay, analytic a priori, synthetic a posteriori. There's the only two kinds of truths, and that makes a lot of sense. Okay, but we got a problem. And this is what we talked about when we talked about Hume. Once he sets it up like that way, and it makes a lot of sense to do it that way, then all of a sudden it turns out we really can't know a lot of the things that we think we know. So we end up being skeptics. So example here is this sentence here: every event has a cause. Okay, is it a relation of ideas or is it a matter of fact? Well, Hume had a test, okay, and here's the test. We take our original claim, top bullet, every event has a cause, then we deny it. So to deny that statement, you just stick a not in there, okay? It's not the case that every event has a cause, or not every event has a cause. And then we ask, is that a contradiction? Okay, is it a contradiction to say that there are some events that don't have causes? No. Okay, it would be a contradiction to say that some what don't have causes. Is there any word that by definition must have a cause? Effect, right? Good. That's perfect. It would be a contradiction to say there are some effects that don't have causes, because every effect has to have a cause, right? Cause and effect. But event is a more general. To say that it's an event doesn't say that it was an effect. It's just to say that it's something that happened. Could it be possible that some things just happen randomly, uncaused? Yeah, it's not part of the definition of event to say that it must have a cause. So no contradiction, so it's not a relation of ideas. So if it's true, it's got to be what? It's got to be a matter of fact. Exactly. And matters of fact can only be known by sense experience. Then the question is, what kind of sense experience would prove that? What kind of sense experience would prove that? Okay, I told you there at the bottom, none, so it's unknowable, but why? Why would no sense experience prove that? Okay, it sounds tricky, but it's really a lot easier to figure out.
Is he saying that our sensitive experiences are synthetic, so they're all hallucinatory?
No, it's a lot simpler than that. Okay, that's good. It's a lot simpler. What's that?
Is it not true?
Because what's not true?
Our senses?
No, he's not even going to prove that, all right? It's even simpler than that. Okay, so that original statement is about what?
Causation.
Well, it's about every. Did you say what? You said.
Causation.
No, and okay, now that's good. That's not the thing to look at though, right? Earlier in the sentence, it's about what? Every event. Okay. Can you have a sense experience of every event? No. I mean, there are things going on across the universe that we just don't have any access to, right? So you see why it's really an easy thing to understand? At best, by sense experience, all you could know is that some events have causes. That's all that human sense experience could give you, is that some events have causes. Sense experience alone won't give you knowledge of the universal. Okay? It's the universality of the claim that's the problem. It's about every sense experience. And when we say every sense experience, we mean every sense experience everywhere in the universe and at all times. Okay? But there were events that occurred before I existed. There will be events that occur on Earth after I'm dead, not caring anymore about what happens. So, do you see? My sense experience can never give me any information about what's happening at any places or times when I don't exist. So, and that's the problem. Okay, you see? So you can't verify that by sense experience. It's the universality of the claim that's the problem. Okay, now enough with Hume. Okay, now we move into science. Okay, Kant really concerned about science. So here's a quote from Galileo: "Science is mathematical, essentially." That's a big shift in the 1600s to from a kind of Aristotelian science to a kind of science that's not just empirical but mathematical in a sense. Okay, so let's think about some problems. So generate the problem that Kant's trying to solve. Here's Newton's second law. Okay, force equals mass times acceleration. So one thing that is interesting about this is that what Newton here is trying to describe is something that the world operates like this. Well, I mean, why is it so simple and so precise? Why think that a formula that's going to capture the way the world works is going to look like this, a really simple relation between three features of the world: force, mass, and acceleration? Okay, so it's simplicity and precision is going to be some issue, but the bigger issues for Kant are those last two questions. Where is this true? If it is true, it's true where?
Everywhere.
Yeah, not just here, right, where I'm doing the experiments to verify it, but presumably it's true everywhere. Okay, do you remember just the slide before? What's the problem with every event has a cause? It's universality. Okay, sense experience can never ground these universal claims. So when we say where is it true, it's true everywhere. That's a kind of universal claim. So when is it true? At all times. Okay, so again, this is a universal claim. So scientific law. How do we verify scientific laws? By the census. It looks like these scientific laws are taken to be universal, so they must be verified by the census since they're scientific, but since they're universal, they can't be verified by the census. You see the problem? That's the problem. Okay, math is going to have a different problem. Okay, so anybody a math major in here? Okay, I was a math and philosophy major in science, or an undergrad after I dropped out of physics. So still enjoyed the math, so I kept up with that. Mathematics is really just a game. If you ask mathematicians, they'll tell you, yeah, that's pretty much true. Now, it's a really hard game that people take really seriously, and some people don't think it's much fun, okay? But it's really just a game. What mathematicians do, they don't take as describing the world, okay? All they do is say, let's dream up some axioms and see what follow from these axioms, okay? So it's not empirical, it's perfectly rational, is the case, completely non-empirical. You derive what's true about math from those assumptions that you make in the axioms. But the problem is, it looks like, and for some strange reason, what mathematicians just dream up seems to be really useful for physicists when it comes to explaining the world. Even things like, I don't know, imaginary numbers. You remember imaginary numbers from like high school math? That's I. So, what's an imaginary number? What's I equal to?
Square root of 1.
Square root of negative 1. Right. Okay. Why is that a problem? Because if it's a square root, it's two things multiplied, or one number multiplied by itself equals this other number. Okay. But if you multiply any number by itself, whether that's positive or negative, what are you going to get? Yeah, you multiply two negative numbers together, then you're going to get a positive number. Multiply two positive numbers, you're going to get a positive number. Which means, what could be the square root of negative 1? Nothing. Okay, does that make any sense? Right. So what mathematicians do is let's just pretend. I mean, that's why they're called imaginary. Let's just pretend that there is a number that we could multiply together, and that would equal negative 1. So, but really, can't be anything like that. Okay, so would you expect that to be at all useful in describing the way the world really is? No, but it turns out about 3 decades later, after mathematicians dreamed this up, turns out that physics has a use for this, okay? And that's just crazy. So why do these things that mathematicians dream up just seem to fit the way that the world really is? All right, laws. How do we know that force equals mass times acceleration is true of everything, everywhere? Well, we don't. No one ever knew it from sense experience, okay? Because Newton didn't have access to everything. He had really limited evidence. Newton didn't even know all the planets that we have existed, okay? Wasn't able to make the observations at the time that Newton lived. So all that Newton could figure out is, well, it's true of this planet, this planet, this planet, okay? So it must be true of all of them. Is that good reasoning? I mean, if you think of that as inductive reasoning, it's really bad. Okay, so why think that it's true of everything everywhere? Okay. That's a problem. Now, okay, so Kant's out to solve these problems. Kant wants to show us how mathematics is possible He wants us to show how natural science is possible, and he wants to show how metaphysics is possible. Okay, we'll look at some example claims here in a little bit. So he thinks it's the same solution is going to solve all three of these problems. It's going to show us how we can, why these mathematical truths have to fit the world, why and how natural science is possible, how can we know what the laws are, and how can we know what the metaphysical truths are. Okay. Everybody got that? Close. Okay, move on. So, and here are examples of all three stuff. Okay, shortest distance between any two points is a straight line. So, is that true? Well, maybe. Okay. That's a truth in what branch of mathematics? It's in geometry. Okay. Now, is this true in every geometry? There's a situation in which the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line. Okay. Why is that? Does that make any sense to say the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line? Have you ever, I don't know why anybody would do this, but you can take the route that a plane flies from, let's say, DFW, right, to London, track that on a map. How's it going to go? Well, it's not going to be straight. It's going to be like this. Now, why would they fly like this? Because it's the shortest distance. Okay? Does that make any sense?
I mean, technically, you could go straight and went through the ground, but like...
No. All right, here.
What you're talking about is in like three-dimensional, like, because they're flying over the land.
Okay. The world is not flat. Okay, it's a globe. Shortest distance between the North Pole and the South Pole doesn't go straight from the North Pole.
That's true.
Okay. Well, this is the problem, right? So you say for an airplane, but it's actually the same for everything else. It all depends on whether space is flat or whether space is curved. Okay, this is an issue in physics. We don't need to go into that, but that's the issue. So, okay, so is it necessarily true that the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line? Well, maybe, okay, but it depends on the nature of space. All bodies attract each other with gravitational force. True? Presumably that seems true, right? What's the nature of gravity? That depends on whether you're going to agree with Newton or Einstein, but presumably it's true. But can we verify that experimentally? No, at best, because again, it's a universal claim, right? I can't verify this by observing all bodies. I just observe some, and then I say they must all be like this, okay? And last, all events have causes. So the first one is in math, the second is physics, or science, right? Third is metaphysics, okay? All three are universal claims, and they're universal claims that are not verifiable by sense experience. Not completely verifiable by sense experience, only partially. Okay, problem. Scientific claims are thought to be universal and necessary. Okay, these laws of science are supposed to be universal. They're true everywhere and at all times, and they're necessarily true. Okay. They're also justified only by empirical evidence, so they're a posteriori claims. So what's the problem? Problem is you can't have both of those. Okay, sense experience will never give you what's universal and necessary, it looks like. And if it's universal and necessary, then it's going to have to be true by reason. If you're a Humean, right, you can know things that are universal and necessary, but they're relations of ideas. And if it's verifiable by sense experience alone, it's a matter of fact. So from Hume's perspective, If all this is true, this problem is that scientific claims are both relations of ideas and matters of fact, but you can't have something that's both. Okay. Yeah, no. So, go on. But that's the problem. Sense experience can't justify a necessary universal fact. All right. So at this point, all Kant's done is shown that, man, it looks like humans giving us a big problem. Okay? At this point, he doesn't have a solution to this. He's only identifying the problem. So if Hume is right, we can't have knowledge of metaphysics, we can't have knowledge of science. We can have knowledge of math, but we just can't expect it to fit the way the world is. Okay? Because math is known only by reason, and to talk about the world, you're going to have to talk about what's known by sense experience. So you can have mathematical knowledge, but it's not about the world. Okay? You can't have knowledge at all about science or metaphysics. So that's the issue. Okay. Here's these terms. We've used these before. So, analytic, true by definition. If that's the case, it's only about the concepts that are internal to our mind. Okay? So thinking of it that way is going to be important just a little bit. It's only about the concepts that are internal to the mind. Synthetic, it's not true by definition. So it's about, it's not just about concepts in the mind. It's about something that's external to the mind, the world, the external world. A priori means it doesn't require sense experience. A posteriori means it does. And these concepts existed before Kant, but Kant's really the person who gives them the names that they have. So really influential philosopher. Okay, now once you get all that down, then we can talk about his solution in those terms. Okay, well, we'll try to figure out what it is, though. Analytic, synthetic, a priori, a posteriori. Good multiple choice questions for a midterm exam. Okay, questions so far? Everybody see the problem that we got? It's really not a difficult problem. The problem is really there are these truths that we think are true everywhere at all times, but the only way we can prove that they're true is by sense experience. And sense experience can only prove what's true here and now. Okay, that's really the heart of the problem. And this is it. So keep saying the same thing over and over again because it's important to understand the issue. So Hume says two kinds of knowledge: analytic a priori or synthetic a posteriori. The analytic can't tell us about the way the world is. It only tells us about the concepts. A posteriori can't tell us about what's universal and necessary. Okay? It only tells us about what's true here and now. Okay. So, all right. Which means, again, science is out, metaphysics is out. If we really can have knowledge of science, really have knowledge of metaphysical truths, then Kant thinks Hume must be missing something. He must be missing a possibility. Okay. So now we got to figure out what that possibility is. Moving on. Okay, so that's consequence. No knowledge of science and metaphysics. giving you a bunch of slides that keep repeating themselves. So probably said that 25 times down. Here's Kant's idea. What if? Okay, he's just proposing something at this point. What if there were, number one, synthetic a priori truths? Okay, Hume thinks that's impossible. Synthetic means it's not just about concepts. A priori means we don't need sense experience to know that they're true. Okay, Kant thinks this would solve the problem. All those things that are universal and necessary, science, metaphysics, if those are synthetic a priori, then we're good. Okay, then we can have knowledge of them. We can have knowledge of things that are universal and necessary because it's a priori, and we can have knowledge of the world in ways that are universal and necessary because it's synthetic. Okay, so that would solve the problem. But now we have to ask, what are these synthetic a priori truths about? What could they possibly be about? So it's got to be something that's not just concepts, but also doesn't require sense experience to know. Okay, not just concepts, but doesn't require sense experience to know. Which means it's something that's neither internal nor is it external to the mind. Okay, it's not about concepts, which are mental states internal to the mind, but it's that would mean that's the that's the synthetic part, right? It's not about the concepts. If it were just about the concepts, it would be analytic. So since it's synthetic, it's not simply about the concepts that are internal to the mind, but the only avenue we have to knowledge about what's external to the mind is sense experience. So since they're a priori and not a posteriori, they can't be about things that are external to the mind. So what is it that is neither internal nor external to the mind? That's not true. There's one thing. What is it? It's not inside the mind. It's not one of the contents of the mind, but it's not external to the mind.
What exactly is external to the mind?
Well, external to the mind, yeah, that's a good question. So the chair is external to my mind, right? It's outside my mind. My feet are external to my mind, presumably. So the room here is external to the mind. Trees are external to the mind. So when we talk about the external world, that's what we're talking about there. No, that's outside. That's outside the mind. But when we talk about what's internal to the mind, then we're talking about things like pain, beliefs, desires. Those are the contents of the mind, mental states. So what's the only thing that is not internal to the mind? It's not just a concept, but it's not external to the mind. It's not something outside. Oh, is there only one thing it could possibly be?
God.
Huh?
God.
Now, God's external to my mind, right? Huh? Us, well, we got to say a little bit more than that, right? Part of me includes, like, my hands, my feet. Again, most of my body is external to my mind, it seems like.
Your soul?
Maybe. That could be right. That depends on. That's a little farther than we want to go, but I mean, if that could turn out to be true. Only one thing it could be? Nobody? No, it's the mind itself. Okay? The mind is not external to itself, right? But it's also not a belief, desire, so on. It's not part of the mind's contents. It just is. That's the only thing it can possibly be. Now, if the mind is the soul, then it's the soul. Okay? You see? But if the mind is the brain, it's the brain. Okay? Does that make sense? Again, it's whatever the mind is neither internal to the mind nor is it external to the mind. It's not part of the mind. The mind is not part of the mind. Does that make sense? Okay. And the mind is not outside of itself. Okay, so it's neither internal nor external to it. Okay, it just is it.
So you're not saying it's a physical, like, organ, you're saying like what we consider a memory.
Well, not maybe I'm saying a physical organ, right? So, but again, just think about it, whatever the mind is, it's going to be true of that. So let's say the mind is the soul. The soul is not internal to the soul, but the soul is not external to the soul. Does it make sense? That's true, right? Both of those. Let's say the mind is the brain. The brain is not internal to the brain, and it's not external to the brain. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, Kant just doesn't want to, it's going to be the same, that's true. You don't say, oh, the brain itself is a piece of the brain. No, it's the whole thing, right? So it's not internal, it's the whole thing. And it's not external, it doesn't exist outside of itself. Does it make sense? Okay, and that's true of basically everything. Okay, so my hat is not an internal part of my hat, right? That doesn't even make any sense to say that. And it's also not external to the hat, okay? Right, that's this, when you talk about anything itself, that's going to be true, that neither internal nor external. So what's not internal to the mind nor external to the mind? Well, it's the mind. Okay, so this is the thing. Okay, Kant believes he's done something miraculous here. Right? Miraculous in the sense of this is a radical change in the way that we view things. So, akin to what's called the Copernican shift. Do you know? Do you know who Copernicus was? So Copernicus was the guy who said, let's restructure our sort of idea of the way the solar system is. So let me see if I can draw this up on the board. Okay, so Aristotle believed, oh, they're yellow. I don't know if I want it yellow. Let's do black. So what's at the center of the solar system for Aristotle? Anybody know? Yeah, so Earth. Earth is right there, okay? Then everything else rotates around the Earth in concentric circles. Okay, so this is Aristotle's view. I don't even know why I continue to write that. Nobody can read that. Okay, so let me make that smaller. All right, so is there that big black stain at the top? That says Aristotle. Okay, so this is Aristotle's view. And now, did Aristotle have empirical evidence for this? Yes. Okay. Well, absolutely. What's Aristotle's evidence? Sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west, right? I see the sun go around there. It looks like it's moving around me, doesn't it? Is the Earth moving? We're talking 300 BC, right? Would anybody 300 BC believe the Earth was moving? Somebody was told Aristotle, hey, actually, you're traveling on this ball that's moving thousands of miles per hour through space. Aristotle would say what? What should be happening if I'm on a ball that's moving thousands of miles through space? Not only should I feel it, I should fall off. Okay? It's like stick a small bug on a baseball and throw the baseball real hard. What's going to happen to the bug? Yeah, bug's gonna fall off. Right? is the case. Okay, it doesn't look like I'm moving. I'm not falling off. Sun looks like it's moving around me. That's all the empirical evidence I have. So Aristotle actually has very good empirical evidence for this. What's the problem? Well, this lasts pretty well until up around the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, right? And then we've got Galileo. And Galileo sees something that's incompatible with Aristotle's evidence. What enables Galileo to see things that Aristotle can't? What does Galileo have? Telescope. Good. Okay. So with the telescope, he can see the way the planets are moving. First of all, he can see Jupiter, and more importantly, he can see the moon, some of the moons of Jupiter, and those moons of Jupiter are going around what? not the Earth, okay? So now Galileo says it can't be the case that everything moves in concentric circles around the Earth because I can see something moving around Jupiter. The other problem is that when you track the motion of the planets, it looks like they go forward for a while and then they back up, and then they go forward again and then they back up. Okay, that's retrograde motion. So it's called retrograde motion. So here's Galileo says, all right, these things look like they're moving around the Earth, but they're not moving around the Earth in nice, simple circles. Okay. Now here's the big thing. See that second bullet point? Could be made to fit the data. You can still keep the Earth at the center and account for that retrograde motion. Any idea how you can do that? Well, what we can have the Earth here, and then we can have the planets moving. Did you have a spirograph when you were a kid? You remember those, like gear things, and you put them together, and they can make nice little patterns like that. These planets could be moving like that. Do you see? And from the Earth's perspective, it would look like, well, they're going forward for a while, and then they back up for a while, then they go forward for a while. Okay, that would account for the data. Another thing that you could do is you could have the Earth here, you could have the sun here, you could have all the planets moving around the sun, and then you could have that whole system moving around the Earth. Okay, that would account for it too. That was the theory of a Danish astronomer named Tycho Brahe. The point here is that you can keep your view of the Earth at the center and account for all this data that seems to conflict with it. It's just that what's wrong with these two scenarios down here, like say this one and that one? Any reason to reject those?
We now know that as we've gone into space travel, we know that we're planets.
Yeah, that's true, right? But what we don't want to say is why should these people not hold those, given what we know now? Okay. Yeah, the problem with these is that, I mean, the story gets more and more complex, right, as you fiddle with it to account for the data. So here's Copernicus. Copernicus says, well, what if we move the sun here to the center, and then we have the Earth going around the sun, and everything else also going around the sun, and that would fix it, okay? That would account for all the data. And which one's simpler? This one here, or let's call this A, call this B, C, which is the simplest one? Yeah, A is simpler. That's the reason to prefer it, okay? So, but notice it's a radical shift. And what it takes is somebody to come along and say, what if we thought about it like this? What if we changed the perspective of the observer? Okay, so it's not, we're changing the perspective of the observer from the center of the whole thing to outside the center. And once we move the observer outside the center, then the whole story becomes really simple. Okay, that's the Copernican shift. Does that make sense? Everybody with me? Okay, so Kant thinks he's doing that. Okay, Kant says here's the old view, is that our knowledge conforms to objects in the world. My mental image of the desk, what I see, conforms to the way the desk really is. Okay. Kant thinks that is the thing that's driving our problem. But, he says, what if the objects that we perceive conform to the structure of the mind? Yeah. So, be right back. So we make the world fit the structure of our minds. Okay. This is going to raise a problem, right? Can I really make the world itself, as it really is, fit the structure of my mind? No, that doesn't make any sense, right? So what is this world that we make fit the structure of our minds? Well, we're going to see what it is. It's what we perceive, Kant thinks, is a combination of the world, as it really is out there, and the way the mind works. Okay, so what I perceive is a combination of the world and the way the mind works. The world provides some input. The mind sort of structures that in a particular way, and that determines what I perceive. Okay. So here's the important thing. What I perceive is not the way the world actually is, necessarily. Okay? It's the way my mind structures that experience. So the problem becomes, how can I know what part is contributed by the world and what part is contributed by the mind? See? The world provides something, my mind provides something. How do I know what's what? Which means, how do I know what the world is really like? Okay, the only way that I can know what's really like is to be able to separate out what's contributed by my mind. Okay, can I do that? Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Well, truth is we can't.
I feel like every time we get close to something making sense, I feel like that's not real.
Then you're back to skepticism, right? Yeah. So, but I'm gonna. I think there's a way that this all is really plausible, but we'll see that at the end. But this is the traditional interpretation. I think we got a significant problem here. So these are Kant's words. Okay, we got two kinds of things. We got noumena, phenomena. The noumena are things as they really are. He calls those things in themselves. Things as they are, independent of the way we experience them to be. Phenomena are things as we experience them to be. Okay, so we can only have knowledge of the phenomena. You know, at a certain level, this is just seems true, right? If you look at certain examples, let's say OETA, that's the Oklahoma Public Television station, Oklahoma City. Let's say the OETA decided they're going to come in and do a documentary on life of the average Oklahoman college student. Okay, so they set up a camera in your dorm room, and they're going to film what you do. So they produce this documentary. Then everybody that watches the documentary is going to be shocked. They're going to say, "Wow, I didn't realize that college students studied so much. They, I always thought they played video games, but you're not doing any of that. They're, you only talk about serious things. And why is that? Are you going to behave the same if a video camera is pointing toward you 24/7? No, right? So how can we know how you really are apart from when anybody's watching? I can't, because I've got no access to that. All right? Does that make sense?
That's for secret camera.
What's that?
Secret camera.
Secret camera, maybe. All right? That's a good point. My example's just shot. Okay, with that. But the point is, how do you know how things are apart from your experience of them? Well, you don't know, because to know how they are, you have to experience them, right? Do you see? Okay, so that's the goal. All right, this is sort of a radical worldview theory. Okay, it's not the same kind of thing when they talk about everybody has a worldview. I mean, this is a worldview that's sort of hardwired into you. So, and the best way to think about it is, imagine seeing the world through glasses that distort the world. Okay, so if you're looking at the world through blue glasses, everything's going to look what? blue. Okay, so that seems simple enough. How do you know that the world really isn't blue? Well, what would you have to do? You got to take the glasses off, all right? But Kant, these glasses are built into the mind. Do you see? So if you can't take the glasses off, then, okay, let me go back to that. If you can't take the glasses off, you just can't know. So that's the best way to think about this version of Kant's theory. Okay, any questions so far? So now you can see how he believes you can't really know how the world genuinely is like apart from experience, because the mind is constructing that experience in at least partly. And since you can't take your mind off and see the world as it really is, then you just can't know how the world really is. You just can't know. Okay, so we got two interpretations. Okay, one of interpretation is what we've been talking about. That's sort of the traditional view of Kant. So the first interpretation is called the two worlds interpretation. That's what we've been discussing. So you got two kinds of things: appearances and things in themselves, things as they really are. Okay, the things in themselves, that's the noumenal world. Man, it's absolutely real. It exists. Things have the properties that they do, even if they're not perceived. Okay, and then you have the phenomenal world, which is the world of appearances. The phenomenal world is the world of ideas. So Kant's theory is called transcendental idealism. We experience only ideas, but there is a world that transcends those things. So unlike Berkeley, for Berkeley that just is the world, right? For Kant, there is a world out there. It's noumenal. The objects that we experience are these mental representations, ideas, that are, again, constructed by the mind, given the input from the world. But the problem here is that we're completely cut off from the noumenal world. Okay, we've got no way to know what the noumenal world is like, because our experiences are constructs of the mind. And when we say things like every event has a cause, we think that's true, we're not talking about the world, the noumenal world. What are we talking about? We're talking about the way the mind orders our experience. Okay? We're talking about the structure of the mind itself. Okay, that's the two worlds interpretation. So what any problems? Anybody see any problems here? Any objections?
How do you distinguish the two?
What's that?
How do you distinguish the two?
Well, yeah, that's in some ways that's a good question. It sort of all depends on how we're going to understand that question. In some ways, Kant's going to say, well, that's just not something you worry about, right? Because you don't need to distinguish the two, because one of them you have absolutely no access to, so don't worry about distinguishing, right? You live in the phenomenal world, okay? You experience the phenomenal world, and that ought to be enough for you. That's sort of the Kantian story. But there's another way to think about that question, is that, Kant's really saying you can't have any knowledge of the noumenal world, right? But at another level, he says, no, there's something we know about the noumenal world. What do we know? Well, I mean, what's it say up there? We know that the objects really do have the properties that they do. We don't know what they are, but they really do have these properties. And we know those objects are what? Can you say that and also say I don't know anything about the noumenal world? That seems inconsistent, right? So here are two objections. One, he says we can't have any knowledge of things in themselves. and yet we know that they exist. Okay. That seems like either that's inconsistent, or if you want to interpret it in such a way that it's inconsistent, it still at least it leads to a radical skepticism about what reality is like. Can't know. Okay. Now, another thing, and we haven't talked about this, but he thinks space and time are part of those constructs of the mind. So the noumenal world exists outside space and time. That's why Kant's not going to be worried. Remember when I said we talked about the shortest distance between 2 points? Is it a straight line or is it a curved line? Well, it depends on what space is really like. Kant says there's nothing like that space. Space is just a part of the structure of the mind. Okay, the mind forces experiences to be in space, right? Sort of the spatial construct. Time's the same thing. Well, if things in themselves are outside space and time, we're in space and time, then how can they causally affect us? Can something that's outside space and time causally affect something that is in space and time? That's a big philosophical puzzle. We're not going to settle that here. I mean, the answer is either yes or no. If you go with no, then you're going to have to. Is that going to give you any kind of problem? If you say that things outside space and time can't affect us in space and time, then what problem do we have here at Oklahoma Baptist University?
God himself says.
Yeah, every time I say this is Oklahoma Baptist University, it's going to be something about God. On a traditional view, God's outside space and time. How can God affect us? So, do we want to continue to think of God outside space and time? So, we'll discuss that when we get to free will some. Okay, well, here's another interpretation. This is called the two aspects interpretation. And if this is what Kant's saying, then at least this could be right. So, because this makes a lot of sense. So, on the two aspects interpretation, the noumenal and phenomenal are not two different worlds, right? They're two aspects of the same world. Okay. Well, there are two ways to understand this. So, first is, on the metaphysical view, what we have are two sets of properties. And those two sets of properties are intrinsic properties and non-intrinsic. Empirical properties will be the non-intrinsic, things we perceive with our senses. But then there are other properties that maybe objects have that we're cut off from when it comes to sense experience. And those are the intrinsic properties. Okay, so it could be, we can only know certain things about objects in the world. We can't know everything about objects in the world. Because, again, some of those properties are things we have access to and others are not. Okay, that's one way of understanding the two aspects interpretation. That's not necessarily my favorite. Here's my favorite, right? And it says, no, it's not a metaphysical distinction, it's an epistemological distinction. There are two kinds of perspectives on the world, right? There's the human perspective, and then there's God's perspective. Which one can we have? Obviously, we're human beings. We can only see the world as a human being sees the world. Okay. Now, actually, it's going to turn out there's a whole lot of other perspectives. What would be another one? There's the human perspective. There's the divine perspective. There's the canine perspective. Right? There's the way that my dog sees the world. There's also the way that an earthworm experiences the world. Okay. Does the earthworm experience the world the same way you experience the world?
Did you have to argue that animals have minds then?
Yeah, I mean, is that a problem?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't want to say it's I mean, it seems obvious to me that animals do have minds. Okay, I don't think they're as robust as our minds, but I mean, my dog surely seems to believe where she can find the food bowl and stuff like that. And when she wants something, like when she wants to play, she makes it clear, something like that. So it seems like my dog has beliefs, desires, so that are much more limited than what you have. Okay, but in order to have beliefs and desires, they have to have minds. So Now, does that mean they have souls? That I don't know. C.S. Lewis thought that dogs went to heaven. So, if you're a pet owner, that gives you some comfort. I don't know that that's true, right? But regardless, it seems they definitely have brains, right? Is the case. So I don't think it's a stretch to think that animals have minds. But it's a good question to ask, right? It's a good problem to work on. But notice the earthworm. When the earthworm is going to perceive things, but the earthworm is not going to be able to perceive the things in this room that you perceive. Okay, does that make sense? Real limited. So the question then becomes, do you have any reason to think that the way the earthworm perceives the world is genuinely the way it is? No. I mean, the earthworm wouldn't even be able to experience some of these things in here. Okay? But by the same token, do we have any reason to think that the way that we perceive the world is the way it really is? No. The only person who actually perceives the world the way it genuinely is has to be what? It has to be God, right? So on this view, this view takes Kant to just be pointing out something that really is obviously true, right? It is not that look, the way that we see the world is kind of limited. What's it limited by? Yeah, it's by our finite, limited minds, right? Does that make sense? So, and we shouldn't believe that the world is exactly the way that we experience it to be, right? Because, again, that experience is limited by our nature as finite creatures. So, God experiences the world as it genuinely is, but we can't see the world from God's perspective. You know, God can tell us something about what God perceives from God's perspective, but we won't see it the same way that God does. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and that seems true to me. Yeah. And if that's all that Kant's doing, then it seems like something like that has to be right. Which also ought to give us a little bit of humility, right? So, yeah. I mean, is there any reason to think? Is there any reason to, let me back up a little bit. So there's a lot of reason to think that something like this is true. Have we talked about blind spot experiment? This is something you can do. It's really easy to do. All you have to do is take a blank sheet of paper, make an X on the left side of the paper, and put a big dot on the right side of the paper. And then you cover up your left eye, okay, and with your right eye, focus on the X that's on the left side of the paper. Then take that paper and move it closer to your face and farther away from your face. You'll find a point where that dot will just disappear. So you're focusing on the X, but you can see the dot outside with your peripheral vision. And at a certain point, the dot will just disappear and there'll just be blank paper there. Or if your paper has lines on it, you'll have a blank spot, but the lines will still be going through. Okay? So it's kind of weird. You try. It's real easy experiment to do. Why does that work like that? Well, because your eye can't perceive anything at the point where the optic nerve attaches to the retina. It doesn't have any receptors there. Okay, so what do you think happens? It's not seeing what's in that spot. Usually, it's compensated by the other eye, but that's why you have to cover one up. But what happens is that your mind tells itself that what's in that spot is probably like what's around it, so it just fills in the gap. Does that make sense? This is why if it's on notebook paper with lines on it, it'll still have that lines going through. Okay, so you're not actually seeing the lines there in that spot. It's just that your mind is filling it in. So we know that our mind sort of fills in the details in a lot of stuff. And sometimes the mind gets it right, sometimes it gets it wrong. That's the point. Okay, yeah, and something like the Kant story is absolutely right. There's another experiment. This is called the phoneme restoration effect. So let me draw this. You can do an experiment where people, different groups hear they hear a recording that says and then there's a sound, the eel, right? That's all they hear is on the and then there's a blank, and different groups have a different word filled in there. So some groups will hear the eel is on the axle, the eel is on the banana, the eel is on the table, but their mind will go back and fill in the extra sound to make sense out of the whole thing. So the people that see this, that hear table, how do they interpret this?
Eating it.
Yeah, the meal is on the table, right? The peel is on the banana, right? The wheel is on the axle. That's what they will hear. But that sound is not in the recording, okay? So where does that sound come from? Their mind is contributing it, okay? It's really strange. So what?
Fish. I thought you were saying eel as in fish.
No. It's just a sound. It's the sound on the recording, right? Yeah. But that as it stands doesn't make any sense. So what happens is that the mind goes in and fills in the gap so that the story can make sense. Again, what the mind is trying to do is construct a consistent, coherent view of the world, but it's a construct in some sorts of way, and it gets it wrong a lot of the times. So again, what we shouldn't say is, well, this has got to be true because that's the way that I saw it. Okay, does that make sense? Or that's the way that I heard it. Or that's the way that I remember it. Have you ever been in an argument with a friend where you said, no, I remember it like this, and they remember it a different way? Who's right? Well, you may be both wrong, actually. Memory is even worse than sense perception. Again, mind goes back, fills in the gaps. So, all right, that's all the time. Oh, yeah, absolutely all the time. So, all right, we survived Kant. He'll come back, but when he comes back, it's a lot easier. So, about ethics.